So now somebody might say, perhaps there's a God. Sure, okay, maybe there's a God, and if so, well, sure, he could do whatever he wanted. He could do miracles and whatever. But that is not proof that Jesus did the miracles as described in the Bible, walking on water, raising the dead, and so on. Fair enough, that's true. In order to make the case that Jesus actually did the miracles as described in the Bible, we're going to have to rely on something else. We're going to need credible eyewitness testimony. So what information do we have about Jesus? And where does it come from? Is it credible? We have records primarily from 4 sources. First is the New Testament of the Bible. Then there's the writings from early church leaders who learned directly from the eyewitness apostles. Third, we have information from outside of the Bible that references these things, including from Jewish and Roman historians. And lastly, there's archaeological discoveries that are constantly ongoing. So let's first take a look at the New Testament. Do we really know who wrote it and when? When was it written? We do. The Gospel according to Mark was written by a man identified as John Mark. Now, John Mark was well known in the early church. He's referred to in the Acts of the Apostles, in the book of Acts, as considered to be a man of means, which meant he had money, which means he was well educated. There was a man named Papias who had known the Apostle John. He studied and learned directly from John, and he was a bishop. He wrote in about the year 125 that this John Mark, was a companion and interpreter for Peter. So in order to interpret for Peter, he'd have to spend time with Peter, and that gave him access to Peter's firsthand eyewitness testimony to everything that Peter had seen. Also, Papias said that Peter was still alive when Mark wrote his gospel. And even that the apostle, meaning Peter, was delighted at the enthusiasm of the people when the gospel was read in the churches. See, the apostles, when they wrote these gospels, they wrote them and used them for the same purpose we do, preaching in their church. Now, Peter died between 64 and 68 AD in Rome. And so the gospel according to Mark then had to be written before then. Again, according to Papias, who said it was written when Peter was still alive. We'll look more about the dating, more at the dating in a minute. One of the reasons we know about the things that were written by Papias and others is due to a man by the name of Eusebius. Eusebius was a biographer for Emperor Constantine. And in addition to writing Constantine's biography, he wrote a 10-book history of the church, chronicling the rise from Jesus' time to Constantine's time, which is just over 300 years. For that reason, Eusebius is called the father of church history. Moving along to Matthew. Matthew is also known as Levi, and he was the brother of the apostle James the Less. Also as recorded by Eusebius in the early 300s, Papias wrote that Matthew compiled the sayings of Christ in the Hebrew language. There's other references that Matthew may have written it in Greek, and it may have been both, because Matthew probably was the most highly educated of the apostles. He manned an important tax station in Capernaum that would have required him to be able to speak multiple languages, even more than just Greek and so on. And so there's a good chance that he might have written it in several languages. Irenaeus, a 2nd century church father, said that Matthew composed his gospel when Peter and Paul were founding the church in Rome, which obviously means when they were both still alive. So there are early church written references that the apostle Matthew was the author of that gospel, and even when he wrote it. It was never doubted in the early church that Matthew the apostle was the author of that gospel. To back that up with some logic, we all know that Matthew the apostle was a tax collector. And you may know that tax collectors were seen as collaborators with Rome. So the Jewish people despised tax collectors. So much so that tax collectors often had to have bodyguards travel with them to prevent them from being assassinated. And so the point is, if somebody else wrote that gospel, not Matthew, if somebody else wrote it, but they wanted to attach an eyewitness apostle's name to it to give it credibility, why wouldn't they pick almost any other apostle that didn't have all that baggage? In other words, if Matthew the apostle didn't write it, it would be very unlikely as somebody to credit him for it, given the hatred of tax collectors by the Jewish people. In all, the evidence points to the gospel according to Matthew as having been written by Matthew the apostle. Again, we'll talk more about when it was written in a minute. That brings us to Luke. Luke wrote both the gospel according to Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Some people look at the Acts of the Apostles as like the 5th gospel. Luke takes up right where he left off with Jesus ascending to heaven. In the very beginning of Luke's gospel, he tells us why he's writing and for whom. He dedicates both his gospel and the book of Acts, the apostles, to a person by the name of Theophilus. And he says this. He said, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write carefully, in order for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the facts concerning the things of which you have been informed. Now, it's not known who this Theophilus was, but he seems to be somebody that may have paid Luke to write a report about Jesus. Now, Luke is not an eyewitness to the events in Jesus' public life, and so where did he get his information from? Well, Luke was a companion and medical advisor, a doctor, for Paul. And he spent a lot of time traveling in time with Paul, and he admired Paul greatly. Now, you may know Paul's story. We don't have time to go into Paul's details about Paul's whole story, but it's fascinating that Paul was a very well-known and highly educated Jewish man who, right after Jesus' death, became like the leading persecutor of Christians, this new movement. And he was on his way to arrest some more Christians and bring them to justice when he had a vision of Jesus, the risen Jesus. And he knocked him down, and he went blind. And in his vision with Jesus, Jesus asked him, "Why are you persecuting me?" And then he told Paul how to get his vision back. 3 days later, Paul got his vision back following Jesus' direction. From that day forward, he went on to become the most prolific evangelist for Christianity ever. And he, again, was a highly well-known, educated Jewish man. So Paul went and 3 years after that event, Paul went and spent 2 weeks in Jerusalem with Peter and with James, learning more about Jesus. So Luke recorded the things that Paul told him that he had learned. But in addition to that, Luke is considered to have been a top-notch historian by other historians, and that he cared deeply about being accurate in what he reported. An example of that is, I mentioned that shipwreck, where Paul's on a boat with 275 other people. When Luke described that shipwreck, he even described the direction the wind was blowing. So historians today are just fascinated with his attention to detail. He's not writing myth. He's giving specifics of daily life. Think about that the next time you hear something read from Luke's gospel in church, that you're hearing words spoken not as a theologian, but as a historian. John Robinson, the author of Redating the New Testament, said this about Luke. He said, "The author of Acts presents himself primarily as a historian, not a theologian." Sir William Ramsay, a Scottish archaeologist and professor, said that Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. Again, this all speaks to Luke's credibility as a source for information. Well, that brings us to John. So who wrote the Gospel according to John? John did. John was one part of Jesus' his inner circle, along with Peter and his brother James. And Constantine's historian, again, Eusebius, reports on a writing from Clement, Clement said the fourth of the Gospels was written by John, one of the disciples. And he also said that of all those who had been with Jesus, meaning his apostles, only Matthew and John wrote Gospels, which is very much what we have always believed, is that the two apostles that wrote Gospels were Matthew and John, and they're the only ones that have left us that information. To back much of this up, there's an Israeli archaeologist named Rami Arav, and he concluded that the primary author of the Gospel of John was probably written by an eyewitness to the events in Jesus' life, and he was very familiar with the surroundings of Jerusalem. Well, why does he say that? In John's Gospel, 5:2, John describes a healing that Jesus performs on a crippled man, and it takes place at this location on the screen. And these are the words that John uses to describe the healing. He says, "Now at the sheep pool in Jerusalem, there's a place with 5 colonnades, like porticos, and its name in the language of the Jews is Bethesda. The evidence of these 5 porticos, these 5 colonnades, was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD and covered up with rubble. And it was only rediscovered by archaeologists in 1888. So that means whoever wrote the Gospel of John had to be familiar with Jerusalem before 70 AD. And remember that Jesus was crucified between 30 and 33 AD. So Jerusalem was destroyed less than 40 years after that. That's exactly the window of time when John the Apostle would be there to write the Gospel. Remember some of the other things that John, so this Jewish archaeologist is saying, whoever wrote this is clearly a witness to some of the events in Jesus' life. Remember some of the other things that John wrote. He wrote that the first person to meet the risen Jesus was Mary Magdalene. John wrote that it was that Jesus appeared to the apostles in the upper room and the doors were locked. First when Thomas wasn't there, and then when he was there, and so on. So when you start looking at, if he's credible in one place, does that mean he's probably credible in the other things that he wrote? John says this about himself at the end of his gospel. He said, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know his testimony is true." Now, just because John says his testimony is true doesn't mean it is, but he's staking his reputation on it. As Craig Bloomberg, the author of the Historical Reliability of the Gospel, says, despite frequent claims to the contrary, evidence remains strong that the Gospels were written by the authors to whom they've traditionally been ascribed, either apostles or close associates of apostles. In the beginning, I said what we need to provide evidence that Jesus did the things that are written about him in the Bible, what we need is eyewitnesses. We have eyewitness testimony. The apostles Matthew and John were writers of the Gospels, and they were eyewitnesses to these events. The Gospel writer Mark was writing what eyewitness Peter told him directly. And Luke is a physician and companion with Paul, and he's considered to be a highly accurate historian. So we know largely, we know who wrote these things, and we're going to look at when it was written. But one of the kind of objections that pops up is that, well, as far as these writers and so on, they were clearly followers of Jesus. And so they're biased. They're biased, and they're going to, make stories up to flatter Jesus and so on and so forth. Well, then that brings a question up. So are the writers and our apostles and so on, are they intending to write myth and story to prop up, or are they intending to tell the truth? Let's see what they had to say about that in their own words. Peter said this, "For we did not follow cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses to his majesty." Peter was captured in the Acts of the Apostles as saying, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of the fact. And John wrote, that from which the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared, we have seen it, and testified to it. Let's talk about dating. I think you're going to see that knowing when they were written is an important point for us to understand. As mentioned in the beginning, one of the myths that's very frequent, very common, is that the Gospels were passed along verbally, the stories about Jesus for many generations, and not being written down for hundreds of years later. Which again, that would create a lot of room. And when you think if that was the case, you'd say, well, how could they remember from being passed along? Things would change, things would be inserted. Is it really accurate or not? I think I'm going to be able to show you that there's a great deal of evidence that all of the New Testament was written not hundreds of years later, but between about a 20 to 40 year window from Jesus' death, keeping in mind again that Jesus died between 30 and 33 AD. Now, the most common and traditional dating of the New Testament by most Bible scholars and so on, that goes back to at least the earliest 20th century, is what you see here. Note that it's something like this. They're similar. If you take a Bible study course, this is often what you're going to hear is dating of when they were written in some kind of window like this. Note that most of them started about 70 AD or later, and there's a reason for that. Note also that these ranges, so like Luke, written somewhere between 70 and 90 AD, there's by no means a firm agreement amongst Bible scholars, as traditional Bible scholars, as to what those ranges should be, where they exactly begin and end, but they're all kind of in this range. But one reason that they're not exactly the same is that you may not realize that there's not a single book in the New Testament that actually dates itself, as far as when it was written, by what's inside. You can date events that they describe. So, Pontius Pilate was in charge of Judea from, a certain, and there's an event he's describing. You can say, okay, that happened at that time. But as far as when the gospel was written, there's nothing inside it. No matter how long you study it, it tells you, okay, it was probably written about here or there. So then how do we know? Then where does the traditional dating come from? Well, primarily came from the process of elimination, using an arbitrary, somewhat arbitrary speculation of dating rather than positive indicators, such as hunches. Hunches about how long the apostles may have preached verbally before finally writing down the first gospel, or how long Mark's may have circulated before Matthew may have picked it up and said, I'm going to write my own for my own reason. Really educated, but hunches still, using a lot of guesswork. However, there is one very solid piece of dating evidence that can tell us what the latest date likely was for when the original Gospels were written, and that is the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. In the year 66 AD, the relations between the Romans and the Jewish people reached a boiling point, and total war broke out, beginning up north in Galilee. And the Romans eventually eliminated that entire Jewish army in the north, and then they worked their way down to Jerusalem. Now, a lot of what we know about the battle for Jerusalem is from a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus. So who was Josephus? Josephus was the commander of that northern army that was wiped out, and he was captured in October of 67. By the time the Jewish army worked their way down to Jerusalem, he was now being camped out with the Romans outside of Jerusalem, present to be a negotiator, to negotiate with the Jewish people surrounded. After the war was over, he wrote a 7-book history of the Jerusalem War called the Jewish War. In the end of the war, the Romans completely destroyed and burned the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and to this day, and that includes the temple. The only thing that survives of the temple, that gigantic structure we looked at, is the Western Wall that you occasionally see if you've either been there, if you visit the Holy Land, or you see on television people inserting their sins between the stones and so on. That's all that remains of the temple. Now, Josephus tells us that over 1 million Jewish people died in the siege around Jerusalem, even though there were only normally 100,000 people that lived there. But the battle began, the siege where they surrounded and the Romans choked off Jerusalem began in April, and that was just as Passover, just after Passover began. So the Romans strategically let pilgrims that had come to the city to make sacrifice, let them in, and they wouldn't let them out. Their goal was to starve the city of food and water, and it worked, but they still didn't surrender. So Josephus tells us that over 1 million people were either killed or starved to death in Jerusalem during that siege, and tens of thousands of others were captured and made into slaves, which mostly worked in mines. The Jewish aristocracy, most of it, the wealthy, the educated, the people that were in charge of Jerusalem, were either crucified afterwards or they were hauled off to Rome in chains to die in the Roman theaters. So think about this. In 70 AD, the Jewish people not only lost this war, but along with it, their capital city of Jerusalem was completely destroyed, including the temple. And the temple was a spectacular structure. We see here, beautiful, and this is just the top part of it. The temple building, the tall part in the middle, that was also about 10 stories high. It was made of gleaming white marble and gold. And this structure was so important to the Jewish people. It was considered to be the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies. The Jewish people believed this is where heaven and earth touched inside this building and where God resided on earth. And that all goes back to the teachings of Moses. The Jewish people took this very seriously. The only one person could set foot in there one single day of the year, the chief priest, and he would wear a leather belt with a rope attached to it. In case he passed out or had a heart attack or something, they could pull him out because they believed that if anyone else stepped foot in there, they would be struck dead. So this temple is so strong and such a big part of the Jewish faith and their way of life. But the city of Jerusalem was also destroyed, as I mentioned. So Jerusalem was the center of the civic government for Israel. So it's like our Washington, D.C. It was also the center of their social life and their financial center. So it's like their Los Angeles and their New York, and of course the center of the religious life, like the Vatican. For us, all these things wrapped up into one city, and had been that way for the last 600 years. Given all this destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and how important it was to the Jewish people, do you know how many references there are in the New Testament to this cataclysmic event for the Jewish people? Not a word. Nothing. No word of it at all. It's as though it never happened. Jesus was Jewish, obviously. So the temple was obviously very important to him, as well as all the apostles. Paul, the writers of the Gospels, maybe with the exception of Luke. No one's sure about Luke, if he was Jewish or not. But in none of those writings is there any description, other than some predictions by Jesus that we'll look at quickly. How could this be? How could it possibly be that with all these Jewish people and their whole world has been destroyed, that they don't even mention this in the Gospels? Explanations for this have been attempted, but the simple and obvious explanation is they hadn't yet occurred. That these events hadn't occurred when these books were written, which means that they had all been written before 70 AD, and that's less than 40 years from Jesus' death. There's more supporting evidence for that, but before we look at that, we should ask ourselves, well, why is it then that more traditional dating all seems to start in 70 AD or later? Well, according to the author of the Redating the New Testament, John Robinson, he said that that later dating scheme really, after 70 AD, is primarily based on the fact that Jesus predicted the destruction of the temples in 3 Gospels. But they're very short and very vague. In Matthew, it says that Jesus was leaving the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Aren't they beautiful and amazing, incredible? He answered them, "You see all these, do you not? I truly say to you, there will not be another stone left upon another that will not be thrown down." And in Mark, it says the same basic thing. And then in Luke, another short, vague prediction, it says, Jesus, when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "The day shall come upon you when your enemies will cast up a bank about you and surround you and hem you in on every side and dash you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you." So Jesus, note that he doesn't say when this is going to happen. Is this 1,000 years from now? Is this, when is this going to, or who does it, or anything like that. It's very short, very vague. So these are the primary foundation for dating these Gospels at the later time frame in the century. John Robinson, the author of Redating the New Testament, said that, frankly, Bible scholars just refuse to accept that Jesus could predict the destruction of the temple. So therefore, they're just assuming that the Gospels had to be written after they happened after 70 AD. But here's the thing. If you're writing these Gospels, and if you want to insert a couple of these very vague predictions in there to make the case that Jesus was divine, well, there's already all kinds of stories in there about him, all kinds of miracles, including rising from the dead and everything else. Is it really his divinity really depending on these very vague, short predictions? The other thing is, if you're writing these predictions to make the point that Jesus is divine, wouldn't you also include in there somewhere that it actually happened, that actually came true? But there's not a word that it did. So that's a relatively weak argument. As Charles Torrey says, and he's an American scholar, historian, and archaeologist, said it's perhaps conceivable, that maybe one evangelist writing after the year 70 AD, if these were written after 70 AD when this happened, it's maybe conceivable that one of the writers would have not mentioned it, but that all 4 would? Incredible. He says what is shown is that all 4 Gospels are written before 70 AD. And here's to back that up. There's actually lots of points to back this up. In interest of time, there's only one I can show you, and that is in the book of Acts. Luke provides incredible details about Paul's conversion, as we talked about his amazing story about his being converted. Luke writes about Paul's many travels to all the cities and places you see on the map that he goes to help build this following, this church. And he even records the actual words that Paul uses at his trials. Luke is fascinated with Paul. With all these incredible details about Paul, you know what he never does? He never references Paul's death. He's writing as though Paul is still alive. That can only mean that Luke wrote the Acts of the Apostles when Paul was still alive. And that's a key factor for us in dating the Gospels, because Paul and the Acts of the Apostles, because Paul was put to death between 61 and 67 AD in Rome. So that means that Luke must have written the Acts then, again, before that, before 60 AD to the late 50s. And remember that he wrote the Acts after he wrote his Gospel. So that pushes up when the Gospel would have been written to maybe the mid-50s. And most Bible scholars believe that Luke based some of his Gospel on the already circulating Gospels of Mark and or Matthew. So that pushes them up as to when they would have to be written. So you can kind of see where this is going. So this is what the dating looks like, according to John Robinson in his 1976 book. He said there's no reason, there's nothing that would tell us that they couldn't have been written even as early as 40 to 45 AD. When you remove that the year 70 item of predictions, this is what the evidence really begins to show. Carsten Thiede, a leading German authority on ancient manuscripts and co-author of Eyewitness to Jesus, grows a growing list of modern biblical scholars who agree with this earlier dating, including renowned American archaeologist and biblical scholar William Albright. So why ultimately does it matter when these were written? Because the dating of when these were written means that not only were the eyewitness apostles the likely authors, as we've got other testimony to, but also, very importantly, that there's a great many of eyewitnesses that were at these events that are being written about that are still alive, to testify to these things or to contradict them. So think about Lazarus being raised from the dead in Bethany. Bethany is about 2 miles from Jerusalem, closer than Quincy is to Boston. So when these are being preached, a person that's only 20 years old watching these events take place, now when these are being preached, is only 35 to 50 years old. And the person could speak up and say, hey, time out. I'm from Bethany, and there's never been a Lazarus that's ever lived there. I don't know, it's a made-up story. Or, Lazarus died and he's still dead. You want me to take you down to his gravesite? Or, yeah, I was there when Jesus raised Lazarus, and it was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. So these eyewitnesses are still alive when these are being preached. And that's pretty powerful, I think.